to the cloud. Okay, so for those, I want to make sure that I've given this talk before to open source engineers. There was a slight technical bent to this. I do, and by the way, the term is quite variable. I'm using the term FOSS, free open source software. Some people call it FLOSS. I asked on Twitter what's the right way to call it, and I got like 12 answers. The open source community is quite fragmented, not a surprise. But I believe if I say FOSS, I'm going to not offend too many open source people. The first group I was going to speak to were people that have some FOSS experience. And I hope that of the people in this room, there is some experience here with some, so we can talk about common experiences. But I think that because we're at a UX conference, I want to pitch this to people that are considering open source and how to approach that. And do that. So by the way, I really hope to get through these slides in 30 minutes, and then we can have a chat afterwards. So please chat your ideas down. I have the chat window open. If you have any burning questions, feel free to jump on them and I'll give it a shot. Okay. So why listen to me? You know, I work for the bad guys. You know, I work for Google, the evil privacy eating company that wants to, you know, eat your babies. And all we do is make money and no open source. And so, yes, I get all that. But what I'm trying to say is that UX kind of transcends money. We can talk about how UX is used in a money corporation or an open source corporation, but UX, I claim, is still UX. Same basic tools, same basic principles. And I would like to think that if we have experience in one domain, we can come over to the other one. And besides, there's this great Pablo Picasso quote that good artists borrow and great artists steal. So if proprietary software is doing some things that open source can steal, let's talk about it. Let's do that. So like I said before, I actually maintained an open source project at Google called the Physical Web. It was an open source project to make URLs discoverable in the real world, so that with your phone, your phone would just sense through Bluetooth Low Energy what URLs around you and present them to you, so you could get maps to a museum or menus at a restaurant and things like that. It was a little ahead of its time, ended up getting canceled, but I got really hooked on open source. Ever since then, I've been trying to help out and contribute to open source projects. And so in spite of my proprietary past, I have been trying to do UX in open source. I've actually volunteered on multiple projects, and honestly, everyone was a disaster. I mean, it was surprisingly hard and challenging. And I kept thinking, like, is this me? Am I doing something wrong? And then I found out, I talked to other UX designers, and no, this is not, we all had a similar thing. And so I decided to write up a talk to talk about it a little bit. So UX designers struggle helping FOSS projects. I believe it's a deep topic, and there's lots of things that we can talk about as a community. And so this talk is about exploring why that is and what we can do about it. And I want to really stress that this is a conversation. This talk is a form of a prototype. I am trying very hard to explore my ideas, and I will be wrong. Like any good prototype, this is a user study right now, and your ideas will then critique it. And if I'm saying something that's completely wrong, I would be thrilled if you'd point it out. So again, write that down and let's talk about it later. So I just get a couple of assumptions out of the way. Not all FOSS projects are UX focused. So I'm not trying to say that every FOSS project needs UX help, but more and more FOSS projects like, say, LibreOffice or GIMP, which really needs help. There is a category of FOSS that needs UX help, and they are having trouble attracting and managing those people. And again, I'm just going to stress this is a discussion. I'm not here to bring you the perfect answer. I'm just trying to say this is my journey, and this is what happened with my projects. And I want to hopefully use that as data for us to discuss. Assumption 2, I am not here to name the projects that I had difficulties with. I do not believe in shaming like this. I don't think it is valuable, but I will talk about what happened in these various projects I joined. And the third one is, not all FOSS projects have bad UX. I don't want to imply that FOSS equals bad UX. I think there's a more subtle point that says there's a FOSS culture and a way of working, and there's a UX culture and a way of working. and how they overlap is what we want to talk about. So one of the stories I'll be telling is about a project where they actually had UX people, they had UX issues, they were welcoming of UX people, and there were still problems. So to me, it's not as simplistic as saying FOSS sucks. That's missing the point entirely. It's really about, let's talk about these two cultures and how we can be sensitive to how we can bring them together. So my first try. I joined a project I thought was really interesting, and I was stunned when I went to their GitHub and there were no UX issues. There was tons of technical issues that can be talked about and discussed, and so clearly all the programming things were there, and if you were a programmer and you wanted to fix a bug, there were dozens of things for you to work on. I had nothing. I was like, where do I start? So, not being deterred, I went in and I just raised an issue saying, hey, I'm a UX designer. I want to help. What can I do? And then I got this response back, which is like, hey, great that you're here. We need icons. And I mean, I've discovered this is a very common request. It's like 9 out of 10 times an open source project will ask for the icons, right? It's just like, come on, guys. So yes, eye roll. I'm happy to do that. It's not beneath me, but there are just so many more important things to do. It's just sad that the only thing that they want a UX designer to do is icons. So, and to me, the way I phrase this when I talk to someone in open source is this idea of how would a programmer feel if the only thing people asked about was unit tests? Unit tests are important. Every programmer needs to do them. But if that was the only thing you talked about, you'd get a little tired about it. And that usually, I think, gets programmers to at least feel a little bit for you. So that's the idea, is that icons are just kind of like UX designers, user test. So, so let's use this idea of an icon request as kind of the way to organize this talk, because I think asking for icons reflects 3 different issues that we can talk about culturally about FOSS culture and UX culture. The first is just simply understanding what UX is. I think that there is just a lack of deeper understanding by many in the FOSS community as to what UX is capable of doing, and we need to broaden that scope. The second is the idea of the tools that FOSS uses, and specifically those tools limit and structure how they think and work and prevent UX from being more effective. And the deeper, more slippery topic, which we could talk a lot about, I want to take a piece of it, is about culture and how the FOSS culture has been grown and built over a while, and how when you overlap what people think about UX, the tools that they have, and the culture that's available, it's not a surprise that the only thing projects can ask for is icons. That's all there's room, because that's all these tools. So my talk here is about how can we give this a nudge? How can we shove these 3 things together a little bit more, make a little bit more room so we can talk about journey maps and UX strategy and user studies and that kind of stuff. So, the goal here is to just shove gently the community so that we can make some more room. So the format in this talk is, after every section, I'm going to have a slide like this that talks about what we do today and what I'd like us to do tomorrow, and then kind of summarize the key points. So the first one, what is UX? So about what I would talk about here is, it's helpful when we talk to non-UX people about how do we boil down what UX is trying to do, especially if they don't really understand it. And so to me, an exercise I like to try is, what's one word that summarizes the goal of UX? And for me, that's perspective. Because the whole idea about a project, any technical project, is that you've got to make a lot of decisions. And how do you make those decisions? How do you prioritize them? And the way UX gets perspective, of course, is by focusing on users. You guys all know this: users, their tasks, and their pain. But it's not technology, right? It's not features. It's really about these aspects of users. And then by understanding and articulating and then delivering design artifacts, whether it's personas or whatever, you can then have these things that teams can share that gives you this focus, that gives you this perspective. And I find this is a framing I like to use when I talk to teams about what we're here to do, because it's not just simply about me walking in and dropping the mic and giving them this brilliant design. It's really about if anything, I would say what UX really is good at is giving us tools for the mind. How do we create this perspective so that the team can make a decision? Now, if you're familiar with open source at all, you're familiar with the Cathedral and the Bazaar. And if you haven't read it, I strongly suggest you do. It's really short. And you can just see this encapsulates, now it's a bit old now, and a lot of FOSS people have now distanced themselves from it, but it is what started this whole thing. And here's a quote from Cathedral and the Bazaar I think is important. Treating your users as code developers is your least hassle route to rapid code development and effective debugging. And this is kind of how a lot of open source started, treating their users as developers that would jump in, look at the code, help out. And of course, any UX designer that sees this just instantly kind of goes sad face, right? Because it's like, come on, guys. This isn't like a little developer club where we're kind of making our own little stuff. We all know that we aren't the typical users, but this is the culture. This is how FOSS has gotten started. And so I wrote a blog post about 5 years ago that got a little bit of traction called The Paradox of Empathy, and where I talked about effectively like the 4 broad categories of UX, just to help people understand, where we are. And I find it's helpful to have this kind of structure. This is kind of the next level down from the word perspective. So to talk about understanding, the understanding has nothing to do with technology. You're doing your user tests, you're doing focus groups, surveys, interviews, personas. It's all about effectively articulating and presenting what users are doing, what's the scope of their life, and where does this product fit in? Because too often products don't understand that they are just one sliver of the user's day, right? And they have to, of course, do a lot more than that. And it's the things that usually flow into your product and flow out of your product that often create the most friction, right? Then there's this idea of bridging, pros and cons of the core technology, what's easy, what's hard. I'm always astounded that teams that have this amazing technology, let's say OCR, right? And you're gonna scan receipts, and then the receipts can be recognized, and they can magically categorize what they're going to do for you. And they don't really focus on the really dumbest part of the product, which is how do you actually create the scans? In my experience, every brilliant core technology requires 1 or 2 additional brilliant core technologies to unlock it. And it's that, adjacent possible. And teams get so excited about the core technology, they don't understand that they actually need additional technology, and UX actually brings that out. So you bridge through understanding what needs to get done. Flowing is this idea of UX versus UI. It's the flow through the product, from screen to screen to screen. What's the journey? I think of UX as the journey and UI as the snapshot. They're both valuable. They're both, frankly, part of the same thing. I don't want to get upset about, in particular, about which term means what. I'm just referring to the fact that there is this journey in general that goes through, and that's paper sketches, UX mockups, motion studies, journey maps, all that stuff that effectively creates the overall structure of what the app needs to be. And then finally is the refining, where you actually get into production mode, design systems, color schemes, animations, copywriting, style guides, and yes, those damn icons. But like, when you have this kind of view of what UX is, and someone asks you for icons, maybe it's a little easier to understand why we get so upset, right? Because like, this is at the very bottom of the list, right? But the higher level point I guess I'm trying to make is this is all about shared vocabulary. How everything that we do should be shared with a broader team, more or less. I mean, not everything, but there should be effectively an output for all of this stuff that the team can consume. Because I strongly believe that design is a team sport. And yes, that raises some concerns about people running away and not understanding how to use some of this data, but that's part of our job. So the way I'd summarize this is that the FOSS community has this belief that I am the user, and sometimes maybe we are the users. And that the big difference that I think UX brings is that we discover the user. We gather the right information to prototype and test shared decisions. And that's an important thing to bring to FOSS. But now I want to go to the next topic, which is tools, to talk about why that's so hard. So we've heard that classic talk that's saying that, give a man a hammer and every problem becomes a nail. I think this definitely shows up in FOSS. And of course, that hammer is Git. I don't know how many people have used Git, but oh my God, it's terrible. And there are better, lighter weight skins on Git that you can use, which I would definitely recommend if possible. But Git is the core funnel through which everything must flow. And so the classic design circle, that there's a million variations of this, I'm sure you've all seen, discussion, research, prototyping type of loop. And that's where you go through these 4 stages of understanding, bridging, flowing, and refining. So there's this very fluid, very flexible, very iterative approach where you're trying to like build these kinds of design artifacts and figure out what's going on. And then what does open source have? They have Git that has files on a repo, right? So they just basically can just check things in. And so it's not a surprise that when they do is icons are the closest deliverable to it, to code. It's kind of like the square peg in the round hole. It's not a surprise that icons is what they ask for because they're files. They can be checked in and they can be, discussed in a very granular way. So I'm more empathetic to why they ask for icons. My goal is to how do we expand and go beyond that a little bit. So in my observation here is that FOSS only asks for the work that fits within their tools, and that is the challenge that we need to break out of. So this leads me to my second try, where I went to a company that actually had UX issues. They had people that were very UX focused. They understood that it was more than icons. Like, yes, I finally found my home, right? And they encouraged me to build a motion study. So there was a window management thing I was doing for a Linux distro. And so I decided to design up what this thing was, and I posted it up as an animated GIF because it was still a Git issue, right? But at least we were going beyond icons and I could actually get some motion into it, and it was a prototype. And so I was like, wow, this is moving forward. So I posted it, and the first comment that came back, so I posted, here's my prototype, very proud of it. And the first response was, if you do that, I'll leave this project. And I was just like, what kind of drama is this? I mean, who talks this way, right? Now, when I've told this story to other designers, they all laugh because there's apparently, this is really common in FOSS projects to have lots of drama and people that have these extreme positions. And so this brings me to the second tool that people use is GitHub issues, or GitLab has its equivalent, whereas because so many open source teams are distributed across large time zone switches and so forth, they assume that the only thing that you can do is to do everything asynchronously through ASCII, through GitHub issues. And it works, for the most part. But it works in the way that kind of vitamins work, as opposed to eating whole foods. They're technically doing the job, but it's much better to have whole foods. And so what I'm trying to say is, what's the whole foods of team discussion? How can we actually meet people face to face? How can we learn their foibles? What kind of tea they like? Do they have kids? What issues are important to them? What makes them angry? What makes them happy? I mean, get to know these people as people. And I think that because of this asynchronous team discussion through issues, we've kind of dehumanized the conversation so that we don't cut people slack. We get angry more quickly and so forth. And I understand that there's time zone issues and remote issues, but I'm saying is there's a cost here and we have to talk about that. Because to a certain extent, only using ASCII is a little bit like Newspeak in 1984. We're limiting what we can express and how we can express it. And so it's harder to do prototypes, it's harder to do post-it notes, it's harder to do war rooms, it's harder to do any type of team things that all UX teams normally do. And it's a very narrow way of expressing ourselves. So I kind of call this tyranny of ASCII. FOSS prioritizes text files and icon files and text discussion. And that is coming for a good reason, but it comes at a great cost. And what UX has historically done is like UX war rooms. Everybody in the team gets together around a table. Well, we didn't do that last year, but we normally would do it. And I think it's coming soon. So you get together, you get in a room, you share a space, you put things on the wall, you create this shared space where people can see things. That's what teams need because it gives you a shared vocabulary and a shared reference. So my challenge is, how do we break out of this tyranny of ASCII and do some more team building kinds of things, more shared stuff, because that's what UX really needs. Okay, my last point, FOSS culture. This is another quote from Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was basically, every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. And again, heavy sigh, right? It's like, oh yeah, the only thing that really makes sense for you to work on as a developer is what you think is important. And I get it, I get where it comes from, but this kind of thing creates chaos because it sets the developers up to be the users. And so when the UX person comes along and does a little bit of research and kind of goes, hey, I want to do a better onboarding process. And the developer will kind of go, well, I don't need it. What's the big deal? And so this is why I often feel that FOSS is kind of like commercial software was in the 1980s. It's 40 years behind the times because it's still driven by a very heavy developer mindset in some cases. What I will tell you though is that UX designers don't want to do this. And we're often seen as like the negative party poopers of an organization. Nope, can't do that. Nope, that's bad. Oh, no, no, no. But it's like, no, we're being put into that role. We don't want to do that. So the idea is more like, I like to say that UX is more like a CFO, right? The CFO is the expert in finance. The CEO runs the whole company, but the CEO needs to understand finance. If the CFO comes in and makes some financial recommendations, the CEO doesn't understand it. What's the point, right? And so a CFO will leave a company if it doesn't think the CEO understands finance. The exact same thing is true for design, right? UX can't do its job if the project lead doesn't get UX, doesn't understand it, at least at a high enough level to know what they're trying to do. And so what I'm trying to say is that for FOSS to really succeed, everybody needs to kind of increase their understanding of what design is doing, what basic structures are in place, what are the basic deliverables. And part of the reason for this talks like this is to have non-UX people see this and understand what UX is trying to do. Unfortunately, as a UX person joining a FOSS project, you may have to do that education. So in conclusion, the reason I want to have another quote from someone who's probably not beloved by the open source community, real artists ship. And I think the variation on this quote is you ship by saying no, because you can't do everything. And good product managers know that, right? The idea here is that by having perspective, by having the focus on the user, by having these design artifacts, by having team discussions, by breaking out of the ASCII jail, we can start having a team discussion so we can say, this feature is more important than this feature. We should prioritize this versus that. And so to me, UX, the beauty of UX, the value of UX is by enabling teams to say no in a way that they can all agree with. But it's only possible if the entire team gets UX. It's like I said before, it's always got to be a team sport. So in my last point is to break out of this mind prison that FOSS has, where it tends to be my opinion versus your opinion versus our goals. And what good UX does is it has these design artifacts that gets the team talking so that they have shared goals so that everybody is kind of going in the same direction. This helps also us break out of the ASCII, prison. So in summary, what is UX is a core problem that hopefully we can fix. We have to understand the impact of tools, and we have to turn open source and UX as a team sport and not an adversarial one. And so I have 3 suggestions that I think all FOSS projects can try as a first step. So remember, good artists borrow, good artists steal. So in the case of what is UX, just see if you can get a FOSS project to do a user study. If they're already doing it, great. But just getting a user study gets them to think outside the box, having them be a different deliverable, and it gets them to start to talk, to say, what does this study mean, and so forth. So give that a shot. Making it a team sport, I would argue that a FOSS project needs to create a UX hit list. Over the next X months, we want to prioritize these 3 UX goals. One of the projects I worked on did just that. I interviewed each of the team leads, there were 5 of them, asked what all of their critical issues were, summarized it into a long document to say, here's the 8 things that I heard that 5 of you asked for. Here's the ones that were most said. I basically created this, and I said, now, you 5 people, go into our room and talk, figure it out, pick 3, and they did. So again, this is not rocket science. This is teamwork. But to create then a design artifact that the whole project can agree on is extremely helpful. And the impact of tools. I understand that there's a lot of remote teams, but figure out a way to discuss in real time. Have a video conference in some way. Ask about their kids. Figure out when they're going on vacation. Just learn about these people and become, more socially in tune with them. I think it will help your offline conversations an awful lot better. So, like I said before, I'm just here to start the conversation. I'm looking forward to your questions on this to see where we can go. And I am also, by the way, looking for other people who are talking about open source and UX, and any links that you can give me to other people. I want to keep this conversation going. So, by the way, this chat was heavily influenced by Jan Dietrich. We had a nice chat a couple months ago on this, and I had a nice long talk with Toby Langell. Both of these are more open source, and they kind of kept me honest on a couple of points. So I wanted to say thank you for that. And I'm going to stop right now. So excellent. I came in just about 30 minutes, and the chat room is open. And so we have 15 minutes that's left if people would like. I'm happy to take questions and discuss any points. And I'll just be quiet for a little bit if there's any questions people have. Otherwise, we can just go into the chat rooms in that Wonder Me that someone set up.
Can I fill some of the silence?
Please do.
So I disagree with you on Git, but that doesn't matter.
Are you a UX designer or are you a programmer?
Primarily the latter, yes.
Okay, doesn't surprise me, but go ahead.
No, I know. But so at the start, you basically said Google doesn't do open source, while like the most popular operating system in the world is Android. And that is open source, and it is made by Google. Now, it's of course a different kind of open source, as to parts of Ubuntu or GIMP or whatever. But so right, you seem to have this passion, and so I'm wondering how you feel about projects like this, projects like Chromium or Firefox. Well, Firefox, I guess, Chromium, Android, things like this.
Oh, no, that's a good question. Thank you for asking it. I might have misspoke. I didn't mean to say, oh, thanks, Rena, appreciate that. I didn't mean to imply that Google doesn't do open source. I meant to say that Google is often perceived by the open source community in a negative way. That was what I was trying to say. I worked on an open source project at Google. I am a huge believer in Chromium. I think Chromium is one of the perfect uses of open source, because Android, like you said, is a little bit different. It's kind of an open view, not an open commit, right? So Google does it and then gives it away for people to kind of fork. Whereas Chromium has multiple people that are working on it, and people really do multiple browsers with it. So I think Chromium is a beautiful example of that. So hopefully that clarifies your point.
Right.
Scott?
Oh yeah.
I wonder, you mentioned that it felt very similar to working on digital products, I think, in the 80s, going in many open source projects. I wonder, did you also find differences comparing your own experiences of where the 80s approach that probably was a lot more engineering driven than nowadays, and open source design projects differ?
I want to make sure I clarify. You're saying, are you asking if there's just other ways in which it showed up other than the engineering side of things?
That could be one way to tackle that, yes. You mentioned just that there were similarities, but I also would guess that working in a company like Apple in the 80s is still very different than the open source culture. So I wonder, yes, maybe we can learn something from those differences, like two different engineering driven cultures, maybe. and how they
Yes.
differ.
Well, and again, my point was somewhat blunt and a little overly stated, because obviously Apple was in the 80s and doing excellent work. And I worked at Apple and got that. My comment was just more just the fact that open source in general just feels way behind. I mean, today, I mean, we can argue that there was just a Jesse James Garrett just had an article about UX theater and how UX isn't really quite being done right. And that's a very fair comment. But I would argue that there is at least an expectation in most consumer profit companies that you have a UX team, that you do user studies and so forth. That's just kind of given. And whereas back in the 80s, I had to fight to do that. I had to convince people to do it. I had to justify it. And so to me, it was my point was justification versus expectation. And I think FOSS is the same way right now. Any UX designer that approaches a smaller FOSS project almost has to fight to be able to do some of these things because the team just doesn't appreciate it. Whereas probably my most pleasant experience as designer was when I was at Apple in the 80s, and I would take a red line diagram to a developer who would say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't quite do that, but I could get this far. Is that okay?" I mean, like he was trying, you know, and if he couldn't do it, he was doing as much as he could. And it's like, no, we'll try this. And eventually he's like, no, we can try this. And so I found the experience of working with Apple in the 80s to be fantastic. And I just wish that there was that type of trust and joint, you know, like, you know what, I can't do that, Scott, you're asking for too much, but I see where you're going from. How can we get close? That's what I feel is missing. And that's what I meant by the 80s versus today. Oh, thanks. Appreciate that, Anna.
Do you see a difference in the organizational structure of these projects and how easy it is for a UX person to contribute to these projects? I assume they're like sometimes, as in my company, we are one company offering open source tooling and we are owning the project ourselves. So as we work in the company, then we can do whatever we want. But in other projects, it's more distributed and it's not this big organizational structure around the project maybe, and you have more more agreement among a group of people that have to do something, whereas you have maybe the CEO giving like, okay, we want to go there, and then people follow more.
No, I think what you said makes a lot of sense. My most pleasant experience with an open source project was when the project owners were themselves very experienced in UX design, right? So that was my CEO, CFO example, right? Yeah. They just got it, and they just they knew what to ask for, and they were there, you know. So to me, I think what I'm hearing from you is it comes from the top down. I mean, to be effective, you know, it's like because all projects have their Linus Torvalds, you know, they have their, you know, dictator in charge. I mean, open source is obviously more open and flexible, but there usually is one or two people that are kind of like calling the shots. And if they get UX, you're fine. Otherwise, you're like sneaking it under the door, right? And you'll do this work and they'll be like, well, why did you try that? You know, and so yeah, I think that's ultimately what I'm asking for, is I'm asking for effectively this maturation of UX and this CEO, CFO analogy I was doing.
So your recommendation would be to then approach these project leads as a first place to see how do they perceive UX work, and then if you can motivate them to do more. Would that be
absolutely? And honestly, I do think that you can't. I want to be very clear that in my stage of my career, I've started to appreciate how arrogant I was, and I now look back on a lot of big mistakes that I made as I was, you know, growing up and being strongly opinionated. I don't wish to throw rocks at FOSS managers who don't understand UX. That's not, you know, my issue is how to be a friendly aid to them, to say, I want to help you. I want to make you go faster. Can we start with a couple of simple things that don't rock the boat? And if you don't like it, I'll leave. You know, don't treat it as an ultimatum. Just say, this is what I do, and let me try to do something really quick and light for you. And honestly, if you don't like it, I'll leave. But like, you know, and that I think is a much more humble approach and usually will win you more hearts and minds. And then like everything, as you do 1 or 2 projects and it works, they'll ask you to do 1 or 2 more, you know, and we'll grow. So to me, I think that more humble, soft approach is what I'm asking for. Now, there are going to be grumpy people that won't get this. And you know what? There's a lot of projects out there. That's the beautiful thing about open source. If you don't like it, try something else. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. No problem. Good question.
Hi, Hesper, I have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can I just pause real quick? I can't see people raising hands. And so so thank you so much for jumping in. Anushka, I think is second. So if I lose track, please just feel free to jump in. But please go ahead with your question.
Sure. I have a question related to the icons because it made me think about the developers wanting icons from the UX people is kind of telling them, hey, this is your sandbox, go and play there and do not touch the other parts of the open source architecture stuff. So in your experience, when it comes to giving the user experience advice, not as in how the UI is looking, but rather how the user flows are working, and which part of the open source activities yields the greatest pushback from the people, greatest pushback to the UX efforts?
I think the biggest pushback, I would argue, is the roadmap, which is why I asked for that UX hit list. We called this effectively stakeholder interviews, because behind every organization, for profit or not, is a group of subgroups that each have their own concerns. And so at Frog Design, when I was a creative director there, we would talk to each individual leader and say, what's keeping you up at night? What worries you? And there is a lot of sociology, I think, in UX that's not really part of design. So to me, the most important thing is to talk to the leaders of the open source community, interview them, create this list of what's critical to them, make sure that they feel heard, and then say, okay, given all these issues, can we agree on what can be done? So like there was one particular project I was working on where they wanted to improve the toolbar at the top of the screen, but it was dependent upon using a different, Linux library, and that library had a cost. And so one person was going to fight tooth and nail. So through reasons that had nothing to do with UX, they were never going to support doing this thing. So the conversation became, do we want to move to this library, which changed the conversation entirely. Turns out it wasn't that hard, it was coming, and so forth. So to me, having this UX hit list allows you to deconstruct the knot a little bit. And so that's more UX strategy as opposed to more UI type work. But I would argue that's exactly what FOSS projects need, is this higher level hit list item, because it encourages so much communication. It's kind of a vague answer, but I hope that kind of got to what you were saying.
No, this is actually a very precise answer and exactly what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Good. Okay, thank you. Anushka?
Thank you very much for your great presentation. I'm giving a presentation about radical transparency later because, well, I accidentally stumbled into a very open source and open development project of the COVID-19 app in the Netherlands. And so I was part of the Slack community there. And I got to know Git, and wow, I got to know exactly this mentality of, we are the user versus discover the user.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that because we often discussed about things, also with the owners of Code for NL, because they and we are very about bridging the gap, between this mentality of, wow, I'm going into the discussions about ideas and everything is, and it was overwhelming over there in this Slack community of the Code for NL, talking, discussing, trying to have a dialogue about.
Yeah.
And as a UX, you know how that works, but it was overwhelming to experience that in this community, which was very code-based because it's Code for Now, although they also want to be designed in Code for Now. So thank you. I've learned a lot with by your talk. I'm looking forward to trying to apply some tips and tricks you gave.
Well, thank you for that. And I really appreciate you saying that because it helped me reformulate what I think my talk was about. Because now in hearing you, part of my talk, I think, isn't about making sure UX designers understand like the social headwinds that they're going to face and not to be surprised by it. And then to kind of make us feel a little bit calmer and more understanding of what we bring to the table, and to have the confidence and to ask for what we need, right? Because when we walk in quietly asking what, we'll be given icons. And what I'm suggesting,
exactly this.
I'm sorry?
It's exactly this what's being asked in this, because there was this one hand, there was this big discussions about things which we weren't used to talk about, very 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 important stuff, because COVID-19, I mean, what are we talking about? It's very important. So we want to do it very thoroughly, the way we are doing that as UXers. And then this was a very different way of working. But the other thing was they asked for icons.
No, they did.
Exactly, as you say. So sorry.
Yeah. No. But the other thing I would say, though, is I've noticed this with an awful lot of recent graduates from UX design schools. They get lost in the process. So if they go to an open source project, they're saying, well, give me 3 months and I'm going to go do all of these things. And I'm going to come back with you with a persona. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? Get out of here, right? You do have to, I think, be closely tied to whatever the release schedule is. So for a UX designer to be part of the solution, to be quick and efficient and fast, to say, I need to do user studies and I need to do these things, but let me try to give you something as quickly as possible. Or, so I do believe that there is a certain maturation that UX designers need to have, which is to be part of the solution as quickly as possible. Because too many UX people, too many UX graduates, I think just are almost blinded by process and they want to do too much and they slow things down. I think a good UX person speeds things up, and that really will win you hearts and minds on these teams. So we are out of time, but my contact details, I just want to make sure it's, this is me on Twitter, and here's my email address. And I hope we can kind of continue conversations like this. Feel free to reach out to me. And I really appreciate you guys giving me the chance to talk. And there's some excellent questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.